Chapter 17 Be Strong. By the year 1934, I was still in Nottingham, teaching in Ilkeston Road Junior Girls' School, where I had a delightful 2 years with bright 9- and 10-year-old girls. Then I was asked if I would take charge of a class of dull and backward children, referred to for convenience as the D's and B's. I was told that the authorities had decided that the less able children in a 3- or 4-year age range were to be put together into one class, the new psychological test having revealed that they were all at the same mental age level, and that it would need a teacher of wide experience and sympathetic nature to deal with them. My class consisted of 24 children of mental age around 6 years and chronological age 7 to 10 years. The Education Committee had provided a generous supply of teaching apparatus, and I set out to give these children fun in the process of learning, not the sophisticated fun of solving problems and learning how to use verbs and adjectives, but a more primitive enjoyment, which I could share with them. They sang songs and skipped to music, with skipping ropes, and bounced balls to music. They stood, each at an easel, and freely painted most attractive patterns with long brushes and bright powder colors, and they took a nature walk once a week. I had an enlightened headmistress who approved of my bias towards nature study, and when bus fares were in short supply, she supplemented these from the credit balance in the school fund. At the bottom of Ilkeston Road, there was a gate leading onto the canal bank. Sometimes we took the trolley bus down to this gate and walked along the tow path towards a spinney and a few fields. I had an anxious time shepherding 24 little D's and B's alongside the water, where there were such exciting discoveries to be made. On the way, I would poke in the weeds and collect new inmates for the classroom aquarium, a water beetle, or water scorpion, or a few caddis grubs, which were deposited in out-thrust jam jars and proudly carried back to school. When we reached the spinney, I let the children break out of line and go exploring on their own, saying, for instance, "Come back when I blow the whistle, and we'll see who has the most flowers, or leaves, or berries." The first time I did this, I expected them to bring me little fistful of primroses. I knew there were some hidden among the leaves, because I had been down there at the weekend to find out. The children scampered off like a lot of puppies, while I followed at a more leisurely pace. Suddenly, I was shocked to hear a chorus of screams. A number of children came running towards me, shrieking, "Miss, miss, there's a crocodile." "A crocodile," I said. They must have seen a queer tree shape lying on the ground, I thought. I said, "Show me," and they took my hands to lead me to the monster. As we approached a fallen tree, some of them hung back in fear. The others stooped down and held back the leaves to show me a frog, gazing up with bulbous eyes. He was a tame little fellow who let me pick him up, and he sang his croaking song when I rubbed him under the arms. Soon they were brave enough to touch him too. One summer day we went further afield, taking the trolley out to Wallaton Park. When we came to the terminus, they fell out of the bus crying, "Daffodils!" and spread out all over the wide grass verges, pulling handfuls of dandelions, which were soon wilting sadly in their hot little hands. Out of school, my own chief joys continued to be associated with the beauty of the out-of-doors, and I relived my experiences throughout the day between the weekends, remembering, for instance, the picture of the black silhouettes of elm trees against a winter sky, or a hedge where the yellow catkins hang above the water, and bars of saffron streak the evening sky, in spite of the rattling of the tram cars, past the school windows. In the school staff room one day, one of my colleagues made a suggestion. "Why don't you send some of your poems to the BBC?" she said. "The BBC," I echoed. "What for?" "They might read one over the air," she replied. "It's worth trying." I had written a long verse about the Nottingham Central Market, which I would visit on a Saturday morning when I knew I should not be able to get into the country that weekend. Here I found country stalls displaying bunches of snowdrops and aconites, which a few hours earlier had nestled in the wet grass in a Nottinghamshire village garden. Cream cheese, jars of honey, primroses and pussy willows, bunches of honeysuckle, and other joys in season. I decided that this poem would make an appropriate entry to submit to the BBC. I received an immediate response, being called up for an audition to be held in Birmingham on the following Wednesday, and my head mistress sent me to see the Director of Education at his office in the town to request permission to be absent from school for the purpose. The director told me indulgently that I was putting Nottingham on the map, and gave me leave of absence for the whole day, to the indignation of another member of the staff, who had been refused leave to attend her cousin's wedding. I took with me, in case the interviewer did not like the poem, a second script describing a nature walk I had taken with some of the older girls, when we went into the country to gather primroses and wood anemones. When I arrived at the Birmingham Midlands studios, I was taken into a room with padded walls and deep-piled carpets, and with a clock face on the wall that hypnotized me. A long arm on this revolved, ticking away the seconds. I was gazing at the clock when a voice spoke out of nowhere and told me that when the green light shone, I was to start reading the script I had brought with me. Before I was halfway through it, however, a lady came into the room and asked me to stop. She said that if they required me to give a talk on the air, I should be notified in a few days' time. What subject would I like to talk about, if accepted? For a moment I was dumb. Then there floated into my memory the picture of two graceful, long-legged birds flying high over Appleby Woods, which my father had once pointed out to me as herons. I said I would like to talk about herons. though I knew absolutely nothing about the subject. The contract arrived a few days later. I was to give a 12-minute talk on life in a heronry at 5:15 p.m. on Wednesday, May 27, 1936, in the Children's Hour program. The rehearsal would begin at 4:30 p.m. The fee would be 3 guineas. After school that day, I hurried to the reference room of the main branch of Nottingham Public Library and borrowed an encyclopedia. When I told the librarian about my forthcoming broadcast talk, I was too thrilled about it to be able to keep the matter to myself. He brought me a book entitled Report on the British Birds, Census of the Heronries, 1928, and I found from it that the largest heronry in England, containing over 100 nests, was situated in Milton Park near Peterborough, on the estate of Earl Fitzwilliam. I wrote to the Earl and told him about my proposed talk, and asked permission to visit the heronry. He wrote back at once, sending me a book about herons, and putting the services of his gamekeeper at my disposal for the day, if I should come to Milton Park. Peterborough was too far from Nottingham for me to be able to cycle there, so I took a Sunday excursion train and set out to walk from the station to the gamekeeper's lodge. On the way, I heard trilling bird song from all sides. I could not identify in it the song of robin, chaffinch, thrush, or blackbird. Then, looking over the fence that bordered the park, I saw a little brown bird with vibrating throat sitting in a bush, piping its tune merrily for minutes at a time, and answered from 3 directions by similar burst of song. Could it be? Yes, answered the keeper, when I came to his lodge and asked the question. It's a nightingale. They're nesting all over the park, and they sing day and night. The keeper took me through the park towards a wood, in which there was a great deal of noise going on. The trees were thronged with herons' nests. I counted 10 in one tree alone, and from scores of clamorous young throats came the cry, "Get, get, get," which was answered by the parents' "Crarark," as they soared high above the trees, or floated down to their nest with dangling legs, or stood like sentinels on the topmost boughs, surveying the distant landscape. If mother stayed away too long, the youngsters peered down at me, or raised themselves on their thin legs, and flapped their wings, and scuffled with each other. As soon as a returning bird was sighted, the clamor became uproar, until the parent had disgorged a meal of half-digested fish into the gaping beaks of his young. I wanted to climb up to the nest, and so we returned to the lodge and fetched the longest ladder we could find, but the trees were so tall and the lowest branches so far above the ground that the ladder could not reach them. I assumed that the talk was a success because the BBC gave me another contract after the summer holidays, and I read my poem, Nottingham Market, on the 28th of October. I was now 30 years of age, and the dream that I had cherished since my late teens was beginning to fade. What chance had I of meeting congenial members of the opposite sex? Even at home, I had no friends, since we now lived in a strange environment in which we must wait to become accepted. And in any case, Malvern in those days was a town of retired people, so when one sunny evening in Nottingham I noticed a personable young man coming deliberately across the road towards me, I looked at him with interest. "Hello," he said, with a smile. I saw that the young man was a stranger, but I did not snub him, and he fell in beside me, walking up the hill. My companion was about my own age, and I liked his appearance. I had hoped to marry young, so that I might be young with my children. I loved my own mother dearly, but I was conscious of the age gap between us. There were subjects of discussion which by her Victorian standards were taboo. I wanted to be able to talk to my own daughters, to spare them the unhappiness which I had suffered, and to share with them the joys. Now this educated and attractive young man had sought me out, and the dying hope began to flare into life again. During that week we met every evening, walking in the Arboretum and in the streets of Nottingham. Then on the Friday evening, his car being, as he said, in dock, we took a bus ride out to Radcliffe-on-Trent, and walked in the fields beside the river. And he was tender with me. I was happy with the prospect of fulfillment. He said, as we parted, that he would be away until the next weekend, but he would come back in his car, and we would go out together on the Saturday. When the young man failed to turn up as planned, and there was no letter of explanation, it began to dawn on me that he had never intended to come. For another week I waited for a letter. Then I realized that he had just been amusing himself, and my distress was acute. On the Saturday afternoon I set out on my bicycle to the country to try to get rid of my misery. The road was white and dusty with the heat, and the lanes were almost deserted. The occupants of the occasional car were unlikely to notice my tears. I approached a village and saw a little church set back in a shady graveyard, with an avenue of yew trees curving to its door. After the dust and glare of the road, the cool invitation of the churchyard was irresistible. I dismounted and leaned my machine against the hedge, then opened the lych gate and walked up the path. I lifted the heavy latch on the door and stepped inside the church. The interior was as cool as a well and permeated with the smell of oak and old leather and altar flowers. Here there was peace, and I was grateful for it. For a long time I sat in a pew, just soaking in the coolness and the silence. Then I began to think of the future. What should I become? Must I go on for another 30 years, friendless, loveless, childless? Should I indeed become an acidulated spinster? Perhaps I was one already. Should I, in middle age, welcome each new day with the remark, "Another day nearer retirement," like the oldest member of staff in my present school? If only I could pierce the veil of the future. I slipped to my knees on the hassock and asked God to reveal His will for me. I opened my mind and waited for Him to speak. There was no reply. I sat in the pew again and looked at the east window. The twigs of a yew branch brushing against the glass made a little scratching sound. I remembered that once, when I was a schoolgirl, someone had told me that if you wanted to hear the voice of God, you should make the sign of the cross over a Bible and then open it at random. The words you then read would be his message to you. I had tried this out, but I got involved with a list of genealogies and could make nothing of them. Now I really, desperately, wanted to know what he would have me do. There was a book on the ledge of the pew. I picked it up with purpose and knelt down. I made my petition and I opened the book. As I read down the page, the first words made no impact upon me. Then suddenly, a sentence leapt out as though embossed in letters of gold. Tarry thou the Lord's leisure, be strong, and he will comfort thine heart. I was shaken to the depths. This was the perfect answer to my prayer. To me, a blinding revelation of the existence of a personal God. I believed in God now, not because I ought to believe in him, not merely because the people I trusted said that he existed, but because I had experienced him, and knowledge derived in that way can never be taken away. Now I knew that God was aware of my troubles, and everything was under control. I would indeed be strong, and I would cheerfully wait until he had time to attend to my needs. Chapter 18. Out West. Another school year began. During the autumn, the weekly hockey games gave me a legitimate excuse for standing in green fields and enjoying the scenery. I played for a country team as a not very capable goalie, and when the game was at the other end of the field, I had plenty of opportunity for watching the changing color of the clouds, or the quarreling of the rooks, or the mist rolling in from the river. On my way home one murky November afternoon, I saw a branch of holly leaning down from a garden wall. I stretched up my arm and broke a piece off. Then I saw that it was bearing green flower buds. I put it in a vase and kept it in my bedroom, and in January the buds opened into white blossoms. In the spring I became filled with despondency again over my own way of life. For 8 years I had been a school teacher, working in the city of Nottingham, and yet I still knew no family on whom I could drop in when I felt the need for companionship. I did have friends, but they were most of them in the same boat as myself, occupying lodgings in somebody else's house. There were 1 or 2 fellow teachers with whom I could perhaps go to the movies when I wanted to celebrate payday, for instance, and I had a young friend, Cicely, who asked me to tea sometimes, but most of my leisure hours were spent alone. My financial resources, too, were always strained. We were paid monthly. Some months were longer than others, and by the time I came to the last week of the long months, I was hard put to it to raise the necessary school bus fares. One evening, Cicely's father heard me discussing with her my financial situation, and he had a word with me afterwards, suggesting a plan which earned my heartfelt gratitude. Whenever I was in desperate straits, I was to go to his office in the town and ask his secretary to advance me the 5 or 10 shillings that I needed to tide me over my difficulties. She would give me a receipt to sign and put it in the cash box. Then when I returned the money, a few days later, she would give me back my receipt. I had reason for several years to be grateful for this arrangement. One day I picked up a copy of the Royal Geographical Magazine at the public library. I looked in wonder at the pages of pictures of fields of flowers in the Rocky Mountains and the Andes, and then transferred my thoughts to the view from my bedroom window, the rows and rows of chimney pots and tight little box-like gardens bound by high brick walls, and I thought, how can I go on enduring this when there is so much beauty in the world? But how on earth did one get to the Andes and the Rocky Mountains? The fare alone would take 3 or 4 months' pay. It was all I could do to save the railway fare to go to Malvern at holiday times. That night I knelt by my bed and made another desperate appeal for help. How could I break out from my cramped and monotonous existence? At home, at least, my cravings for beauty were satisfied. I understood now what a privation it had been to my mother to endure the atmosphere of a steel town after that of Worcestershire, and I spent a lot of time climbing the hills and exploring the byways. One day, to my joy, I met my old friend Dorothy, now a wife and mother, and living in the neighborhood. How I envied her! That Easter Auntie Claire came to visit us, bringing with her a friend whom I had not met before. We went for an evening walk along the terraces of the Sugarloaf Hill and up to the crest of the ridge where we could overlook the town of Great Malvern immediately below and the city of Worcester in the middle distance, then turn to the sunset and stretch our eyes as far as the outline of the Welsh mountains. Auntie Claire's friend was also a school teacher. She talked about the school in which she had taught in Australia. Then she asked me, "Why don't you go and teach in another part of the empire?" "Me," I said, startled. "Why, I couldn't afford it. Besides, Daddy would never let me give up my job to go in for anything so risky." "There is no risk involved," she said, "and you wouldn't have to give up your job. All I had to do, it seemed, was to get leave of absence for a year from my present education authority and write to the society which organized the exchange, and of course pay the fare. I was so eager to get things moving that I could hardly bear to wait till the end of the holiday to get the necessary leave of absence. But soon all the arrangements were made, and I learned that I was to exchange posts with a teacher in a city called Prince Rupert, on the far west coast of Canada. I made another trip to the reference library, and found that Prince Rupert was a fishing town near the mouth of the Skeena River in northern British Columbia, and I compared it mentally with Grimsby, a fishing town near the mouth of the River Humber. I had much to learn. My mother's younger brother had immigrated to Canada 40 years earlier. It was 20 or more years since she had heard from him, and at that time he had had a Vancouver address. I wrote to Vancouver and was immediately put in touch with him. My father's anxiety was assuaged when he knew that I should be met by relatives when I arrived there. I had been told in England that I should have to go on to Prince Rupert from Vancouver by boat, and with the Lincolnshire image still in my mind, I had expected a passage like that of the ferry trip from New Holland to Hull. I had a severe shock when I discovered that my supposed ferry crossing would consist of a sea trip of 2 days and nights duration, the distance involved being over 400 miles. As we voyaged along the channel between the forested mountains of Vancouver Island and those of the mainland, I marveled at the way in which my problems had been solved. Already I had traveled 6,000 miles and passed through the Rocky Mountains and the Fraser River Canyon, and unimagined adventures lay ahead. I gazed at the interminable forest, and I said to a fellow passenger, leaning on the rail, "I wish the boat would stop long enough for us to go ashore. We shall call at Ocean Falls tomorrow evening," he replied. "Long enough for us to go for a walk in the woods?" I asked. "The woods?" he queried. "Those," I said, pointing to the shore. "You couldn't go for a walk in those woods," he replied. "Why not?" "Well, for one thing, you'd get lost." I snorted indignantly. "I'm not a baby," I said. "My dear young woman," said my companion, "even an experienced hunter would not go into those forests without an Indian guide." "Indians!" I exclaimed. I had been looking in vain for Indians all the way across Canada, and I had seen only one, a man with his hair plaited into 2 tiny pigtails, leaning against a station wall near Banff. "I haven't seen any Indians yet." "Well, there are some on this boat," was the reply. "Where?" I asked, with immediate interest. He indicated a family group in ordinary dress further down the deck. "Those aren't Indians, surely," I exclaimed, and he replied, "Certainly they are, Pacific Coast Indians," and he told me that these substantially built, Oriental-looking people had never ridden horses or hunted buffalo. They were sea fishers and lived in villages along the coast. When I awoke the next morning, we were dropping anchor in deep water alongside the dock of a little settlement. As the mist cleared, we watched fishing boats bringing in their catch, and I enjoyed the scent of the cedar trees and the smell of the oil from the fish. By early afternoon, we were approaching the open water of Queen Charlotte Sound, where the waters of the Pacific come rolling in to argue with the currents of the Inside Passage. The uninitiated passengers, who, like myself, had eaten too much ice cream at lunch time, were soon feeling squeamish. Then the swell of the billows, curling and receding in front of the windows of the observation lounge, turned us green, and the comfortable seats emptied hurriedly. We had recovered from our indisposition in time to watch the boat dock at Ocean Falls. This was a company-owned paper-making town. The residents were all employees of the paper mill company, and lived in the little white wooden houses that from the water had looked like dolls' houses, clinging to the steep sides of the mountains. When we went ashore, I found that the roads of the town were wooden sidewalks in terrace formation, and even the tennis courts were made of wood. Gardens had been constructed by building platforms and importing soil to dump on these. The natural ground surface consisted of a cushion of sphagnum moss over a foundation of peaty water, known as muskeg. The next morning I awoke to the sound of the fog horn. There was a thick mist outside, and I was told that the channel between the mainland and the islands that fringed the coast was so narrow that the captain kept the fog horn in use, not merely to warn other craft of our presence, but in order to obtain a clue to his proximity to the rocks, which he could gauge from the quality of the echo. We docked in Prince Rupert in evening sunshine, steaming right up to the wharf, which was thronged with people who had come to see the boat arrive. Some of these were meeting friends and relatives who were returning from a holiday outside, that is, in civilization. Others were tourists on their way to Alaska, who had disembarked at Prince Rupert from the boat which had come there a day or two earlier, and were now going to continue their trip. Others were there to greet newcomers like myself. I had soon settled in to my new post as teacher of the boys and girls in grade 4, the 10-year-olds in Borden Street School. My first impression was one of surprise at the amenities. The school was a 3-story building made of wood, with spacious classrooms, whose windows looked to the forested mountains on one side, and to the harbor entrance, and forested far shore on the other. Each classroom had its own cloakroom opening out of it, so that there need be no trouble over lost garments. There was a drinking fountain and a telephone on each floor. If a child forgot to bring shoes or books to school, he would telephone to his home for his mother to bring them. There was no telephone charge. On Friday evening, at the end of my first week, I set out on a journey of exploration. I still longed to walk in the woods. My hostess told me that there was a road of sorts leading out of the town for about a couple of miles into the bush, and I walked by myself for about a mile along it. A thin silver crescent moon hung in a navy blue sky behind the cedar boughs. The road was flanked deeply on both sides by towering tree trunks, and the damp air was saturated with the scent of moss and cedar. I stopped to enjoy the silence, leaning on the handrail of a bridge spanning a little gully. Then suddenly a sound broke that scented silence, a sound like the wail of an animal in pain, and I stiffened. The note changed, and I smiled as I recognized the skirl of bagpipes. A Scotsman in a distant cabin was reminding himself of home. When I came to the waterfront again, I was intrigued by the distant points of flame flickering here and there along the opposite shore. There was no sign of any dwelling over there, nothing but forest. What was the origin of these will-o'-the-wisp lights, I wondered. I was soon to find out. On arriving home, I was told that there had been a telephone call inviting me to a beach picnic. "How lovely!" I exclaimed. "When is it to be?" "Tonight. was the reply. "Tonight," I echoed. "A picnic in the dark." Well, I was ready for anything. I hastened to put on warm outdoor garments, and soon I had joined the party on the dock, waiting to board one of the motor boats drawn up there. It was exhilarating to chug along through the moonlit water towards a distant shore, fringed with pointed pine trees. It was high adventure to help build a huge fire of driftwood, and when it was roaring hot, to hold cages of corn over the flames until the corn popped, to bite into luscious peaches and Macintosh red apples, to pierce a sausage with the prongs of a forked stick and hold it to the glowing embers, to toast marshmallows and drown them in mugs of coffee. We made hot dogs by wedging toasted sausages between the halves of a bread roll. I burnt my sausage, and somebody said, "If that's a hot dog, it's an Aberdeen Terrier." It was not, however, until the very end of my year on exchange, in June 1938, that I was introduced to the sort of life that really spelt Canada to me. Living at close quarters with the wild animals of the bush, hewing logs for the fire and drawing water from the creek. Mr. Fortune, an old-timer in the town, having heard of my ambition to live the life of a pioneer, invited me to make a fourth in his party to go on a weekend fishing trip to the top of a mountain. During the First World War, as a casualty of the Canadian Army in hospital in England, he had been entertained by an English family who had driven him round the local beauty spots. Now he saw an opportunity to return this hospitality in like manner. With the two men in the vanguard and rear guard, and Muriel, the daughter of one of them, and me between, we trekked through the muskeg for a couple of hours, till we came to Lake Diana, surrounded by forest and fringed with yellow water lilies. Our objective was a log cabin on the far shore of the lake, and I wondered how we should reach it, till the men uncovered a rowboat and a canoe which had been hidden under a pile of cedar boughs since their last visit. Muriel and I occupied the canoe, and I had 1 or 2 moments of panic when it rocked, but soon we were splashing to shore and hacking our way through the undergrowth to the shelter which was to be our home until Sunday afternoon. The cabin was a single-roomed building, furnished with home-hewn benches and table, and with cedar boughs strewn on the floor for bedding. A store of logs was neatly stacked against one wall as fuel for the stove, and tinned food lined the shelves. We went out with pails to carry water, and found that the creek was running deep where the beavers had recently dammed it. In the fading light, the men stood on the dam and hacked away with axes to make a breach, for fear the water should overflow and flood our cabin. At bedtime, we rolled ourselves in blankets and curled up on the cedar boughs. I awoke early, but found I was the last out of bed. The men had been on the lake fishing since first light, and soon appeared with a string of rainbow trout for breakfast. Muriel had been for a swim, in the ice-cold mountain water. My first thought was for the dam. I found that the beavers had already repaired our damage of the previous night. During the day we climbed one of the mountains, plowing through the muskeg and clambering up the sides of waterfalls. Mr. Fortune carried his fishing rod with him, knowing that on top of the mountain there was a little lake, and while he plied his rod in vain, we gathered huckleberries and lay on a rock watching the graceful movements of a couple of Arctic terns high overhead in the blue. This brief taste of life in the bush whetted my appetite for more. I decided that I would come out to Canada again sometime, if my parents could do without me, and take a post really in the backwoods. Chapter 19. Another War. After my Canadian adventure as an exchange teacher was over, I returned to Nottingham for the autumn term of 1938. During the months that I had been away, my letters home had circulated among many people who had been so much interested in what I had to say that I had written some articles giving my impressions of Canada, and these had been accepted for publication in a Nottingham weekly journal. Now I decided that it was time I learned to use a typewriter. I asked the visiting commercial teacher in the senior school in which I was now teaching if she could teach me to type. She said, "You can teach yourself if you get a short course manual of typing and work all the exercises in it." So I took a portable typewriter home with me at Christmas time and worked several hours a day, faithfully completing all the exercises given. By the end of the fortnight, I could touch type very slowly, and I was soon to be thankful that I had learned this new skill. The year I had spent away from home had begun to affect my emancipation from the bonds which my family had tied around me. These bonds were bonds of love to my mother. I was always little Philly. To my sister, I was a member of the fourth form. To my father, who perhaps recognized in me a complete difference from himself, I think I was a problem. We were both seekers of knowledge, but my appetite for adventure often shocked him. When my cousin Alice, who was visiting us, told me one day that I constantly disobeyed my mother, I was astonished. My disobedience was certainly not due to a determination to have my own way. On the occasion in question, Alice and I had gone on a cycle ride to visit friends at a village on the River Trent. Mother had given instructions that we were to be back by lighting up time, because we had only one bicycle lamp between us. We made our visit, and were asked to stay for tea, and I was very happy. Whenever Alice reminded me that we must be home before dark, I would say, "Oh, let's stay just a little bit longer." I was sure in my own mind that if Mother knew what a lovely time we were having, she would not want us to start yet. Rumors of the threat of war were now circulating freely. Teachers returned to school at the end of August 1939, in response to an appeal by the Ministry of Education, and I was delivering evacuation notices on the first Sunday morning in September, when the Prime Minister informed the nation that we were now at war with Germany. Since the pupils of the school in which I was teaching lived close to the country. We ourselves were not included in the evacuation scheme. Teaching activities were suspended, however. The children stayed at home, but the teachers had to meet at the school every morning and await instructions from the education committee until noon. This inactivity in face of the emergency drove me nearly frantic. I had several times seen women in khaki, 2 or 3 together, walking about the streets of Nottingham, and I had thought rather contemptuously, women playing at being soldiers. But after 2 weeks of gossip and tea drinking in an empty school, I suddenly thought, perhaps I could join the women's branch of the army, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. I enlisted the next morning, and when I broke the news to my headmistress on Monday morning, her first reaction was an economic one. Have the Education Committee agreed to continue paying your salary? Miss Hadwin asked. Of course not, I said, but my pension rights will continue. But you can't live on army pay, she exclaimed. How much is it anyway? 9 shillings a week, I replied. Miss Hadwin expressed horror. Well, I said, on my teacher's pay, I don't suppose I have as much as 9 shillings a week left for extras, after I have paid my board and lodging and bought clothes, and been to the movies. In the army, all those things are provided free. 2 days later, as ATS volunteer, number 22957, I was on my way to the nearby Chilwell Central Ordnance Depot. I passed through the entrance gates to a huge area, buzzing with activity. Workshops and buildings under construction stretched as far as the eye could see. The roads were thronged with messengers, on foot and on bicycles, hurrying between the buildings. Lister trucks, manned by girls, sped about like wasps in an orchard, and convoys of trucks and heavy vehicles. Some of these, also driven by girls, swung into the vehicle car parks. It seemed to me that a good part of the whole war effort must be concentrated here. I was taken to an office and introduced to the chief clerk, who thrust a typewritten sheet into my hand and said he would be back shortly. I sat on a chair in front of the rows of benches and tried, under the scrutiny of dozens of pairs of masculine eyes, to look like the sort of person who could keep military secrets, though the foolscap sheet could not have made less sense if I'd been holding it upside down. It was a cryptic document, peppered with sets of initials, such as VRS, COO, and OI/C. Soon I had begun my military job as shipping clerk in the vehicle reception store. My boss, a civilian, and I were responsible for the documentation concerned with the dispatching overseas of all military vehicles, and I had to learn how to make out shipping advice and delivery notes and bills of lading, to write to foreign governments in English and advise them what items of equipment would follow later, to make calculations with regard to the amount of shipping space needed to accommodate the vehicles, to work out cost in sterling and other currencies. I was thrilled with my work, and I felt that I was a vital, though minute, cog in the wheel of the war effort. There was now plenty of opportunity for me to improve my speed as a typist. I wished I had taken more pains to learn the position of the numerals on a typewriter, as the identification number of every vehicle had to be entered on the documents. When the consignments included, for instance, 1,000 motorcycles, I was dizzily occupied in typing in quintuplicate the 1,000 six-digit numbers. Life in an office, I soon found, was more relaxed than life in a school. Men had a much less intense attitude towards their work than women had. I now understood why the uninitiated consider that the teacher with a short working day has an easier time than they have. They imagine that our working hours are lived at the pace in which they work, and have no conception of the tensions involved in keeping 30 or 40 children at work for the period of the lesson, and then without respite, admitting another class, with the necessity to adjust one's thoughts, and prepare the blackboard, and give out the exercise books for a different lesson, repeating the procedure over and over again throughout the day. It was not only inside the depot that I found myself greeted by smiles as I went about my work. The khaki uniform seemed to be a passport to friendliness. Once, when I boarded a bus to town, the fare cost me more than half a day's pay. A grimy workman who was just dismounting from it pressed into my hand the return half of his ticket. Once a flower seller in the town filled my arms with flowers and would take no money for them. Once an old lady in a cafe asked me if I would accept a jar of homemade jam, which she had just bought at a bazaar. I began to feel that the frowns which had grown into my brow during the last few years were being smoothed out by this atmosphere of appreciation and good fellowship. As I became more proficient in my work as a shipping clerk, I became increasingly proud of it. I knew the dates and times of sailing of the convoys, the names of the docks from which the vessels were leaving, and sometimes the names of the ships involved, and I was conscious of the trust implied. In the autumn of 1940, my boss made a suggestion. "Why don't you apply for a commission?" he said. I looked at him anxiously. "Do you mean that you think I'm no good at this job?" I asked. "No, I don't mean anything of the sort," he said. "I think you are potential officer material." "Well, thanks," I replied. "What is the procedure for applying for a commission?" I might have learned how to be a shipping clerk, but I knew absolutely nothing about Army procedure. After my qualifications had been vetted by the chief commander, who was the officer commanding the Auxiliary Territorial Service at Chilwell, I was sent to London to be interviewed by Dame Helen Gwyn Vaughan, director of the ATS, posted to Cadet Wing at Bournemouth for a 3 weeks course of training, and passed out of it just before Christmas as company assistant, first lieutenant, number 196242. Chapter 20. Commissioned Officer. On a miserable, slushy January day, I arrived at the requisitioned house in a residential district near Liverpool, where I was to take up my first command, with an isolated platoon of women serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service as drivers, cooks, clerks, and orderlies at the headquarters of a heavy anti-aircraft regiment. I received the warmest of welcomes from the ATS sergeant, as well as from a glowing coal fire in my office, and the attentions of an exuberant black spaniel pup. I stooped down to fondle the puppy. "Whose is he?" I asked. "Yours, ma'am," replied the sergeant. "Mine," I exclaimed. "Who gave him to me?" "The previous officer was not able to take him away with her," said the sergeant, "so she left him for you. I thought it was very generous of my predecessor to leave me her precious puppy." I found my new duties delightful and absorbing, and set out to fill my days with activities which would promote the welfare of the women and contribute towards victory. In the mornings, after the correspondence had been dealt with and the barrack rooms inspected, I would take a long walk to one of the gun sites, with Major, the puppy, frisking along ahead of me and investigating every rabbit hole in the hedge bottom. I had no cooking worries, as the women took their meals in the Royal Artillery Mess. In the afternoons, the orderlies helped me to improve the bare rooms of the girls' quarters. In the evenings, the women were generally free to go to the troops' canteens in the district, except on Fridays, when we had a social evening in the house, and boyfriends in the other services came to dance to the music of the gramophone. The nights were generally interrupted by the wail of the sirens. If this occurred after we had retired to bed, the women trooped down to the basement shelter, carrying their mattresses and blankets, and curled up and went to sleep. The sergeant and corporal and I put on our tin hats and army greatcoats over our pajamas and sat by the office telephone. In the quiet intervals, we walked round the garden with the puppy and chatted to the men of the Home Guard in the next garden, or searched in the moonlight for fallen pieces of shrapnel to keep as souvenirs. 5 weeks after my appointment, I was posted away. An officer whose parents lived in Birkenhead had asked to come to a post nearer her home, so that she could be near them during air raids, and I was bitterly disappointed. I had to leave the puppy behind for my successor. My new unit was working at the barracks of the King's Own Royal Regiment in Lancaster. We kept office hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and in the evenings I sat in my billet, where I had a very pleasant bedroom and sitting room to myself, and wished I was an other rank again, so that I could go to the troops' canteen. There was an officers' club in the town, but I had no one to introduce me to it. I should have had time by now to have overcome my grief about Ronald's death. There had been a time, soon after his death, when I had been much distressed by my inability to recall his features. Even when I looked at his photograph, I could not remember what he looked like. But nowadays I was apt to be shaken by a sudden, vivid recollection of him, caused perhaps by the scent of a cigarette on a bus, or the glimpse of a wrist watch on a man's arm, until I could hardly bear to be alive. I was not at ease among the military officers whom I met, and yet my more intimate feelings were on the rampage again, so that I began to wonder if God really was a loving God. Why did he equip me so prodigally with the means of living a complete life, and yet withhold from me the opportunity to realize its fulfillment? In the spring, I was sent on a course which was intended to teach officers how to instruct women in matters of military procedure. One of our first lectures was given by a gray-haired woman doctor, a psychologist who talked to us about psychological difficulties and invited any of us who felt we needed help to make an appointment with her secretary for an interview, which would be held at the Army's expense. I was pleased to accept this invitation. The problem which worried me, I told the doctor, was that I could not seem to develop a natural relationship with the opposite sex. She asked me how old I was. I'm 33 years of age, I said. Have you ever had a boyfriend? Yes. When? In 1927 and 28. There was a pause. Then the interviewer said, "Well, what happened?" I struggled for composure, but I could not speak. "He disgusted you," she suggested. "No," I said, "he just died." There was a long pause. Then the doctor said, speaking half to herself, 12 years ago, and you are still grieving for him, poor child." At this first word of compassion and understanding, I wept at last, for a time without interruption. Then the doctor said, "Do you know how a baby is born?" I shook my head. She took a sheet of paper and explained to me, diagrammatically and dispassionately, the whole process of conception and birth, and I was able to leave the house with a feeling of ease and relief. By June, I was back in the Midlands, now acting as adjutant to the ATS officer at a divisional headquarters in anti-aircraft command, while she herself was making whirlwind inspections daily of quarters at anti-aircraft sites which were being equipped to accommodate women. In reading the directives which came into the office, I became very envious of the girls who were to be trained to manipulate the instruments that controlled the firing of the heavy anti-aircraft guns, and one morning I found myself commenting aloud on this. I suppose one can make as important a contribution to the war effort by filling in vouchers for Army boots, or by taking a pay parade, I said. But I think these new recruits are getting the real jobs. The senior commander looked up. "Would you be prepared to volunteer for operational duties, Taylor?" she asked. "I should be thrilled," I said. "Right," said the senior commander. "I'll put it in hand straight away." Early in October, I arrived at Oswestry, a garrison of 4 Royal Artillery regiments, for the training of personnel in the principles and practice of anti-aircraft ack-ack fire. The trainees were now, for the first time, women. About 20 women officers had arrived that day. We were all to be interviewed by the colonel the next morning. That evening, senior military officers from the War Office discussed with us our academic attainments, especially with regard to mathematics. They seemed to be amazed by our keenness. I could hardly wait to learn what my new work was to be. The following morning I went in for interview and saluted smartly. The colonel held my eyes in a long, piercing look as he greeted me. His first question, however, threw me off balance. "Can you teach PT?" he asked. "I am not a physical training specialist, sir," I said, "but I have taught PT to young children." Then I added, "I've come here to do operational duties." The colonel gave me a quizzical look. "I'm afraid," he said, "you'll have to be our PT officer for the time being." Crestfallen, I returned to the garrison mess and sat in the anteroom talking to my colleagues. It turned out that they had all been asked the same question, and had taken jolly good care to say no. They were all young and healthy-looking, and some had only recently left their public schools. Surely, I thought, they were more capable of exercising young women than I was. As the days went by, I became still more convinced of this. I had a huge gymnasium to command, with my own private office attached, and my days were exhaustingly occupied. The battery commanders had drawn up timetables, as for their soldiers, allotting a daily 45-minute period of physical training to each of the 4 batteries. The difference was that there had been a number of highly qualified male NCOs to instruct the men, whereas I was the only woman appointed to teach the ATS. I followed the Board of Education syllabus of physical training, combining with it anything that I could remember having done in adult health and beauty programs, until I was on the point of collapse. Then an appeal to the adjutant resulted in a directive to the battery commanders that suitable women were to be released from operational work for training by me as PT corporals as soon as I had a group of keen young girls doing the active work. The officers of 2 regiments shared garrison mess. Our own regiment was working on a mysterious new science called radiolocation. The girls manning the instruments were operators fire control, and the regiment was called OFC. Whenever I had leisure from my work in the gym, I would slip into the back of a class to try to assimilate some of the theory, or stand inside the cabin where a crew was at work and silently watch the procedure. The women in the other regiment were concerned with the range finders and predictors which kept the guns informed of the behavior of invading aircraft. The windows of the officers' mess looked out across the football pitch to the squads at work on the garrison square, the girls wearing tin hats and battle dress, boots, leather gaiters, and trousers with their battle blouses, manning the predictors, running into position on the word of command, leaping into their seats on the cumbersome-looking equipment, and swinging it into position while they called out, "Traverse left, left, steady, on target, then the height readings, 6, 400, 6, 600, 6, 800. The military NCOs had taught the girls how to make their voices carry, placing them at opposite sides of the football pitch and rehearsing them in voice production. The pupils looked incongruously feminine, their helmets tip-tilted, framed by a wind-swept halo of curls as their voices floated across the field. From the predictors, electric cables carried the information to the guns, and the men at work there, furiously turning the traversing gear, which rotated the platform, setting the practice fuses, loading the rounds. All day the square was humming with activity as the practical work went on, and all day in the classrooms the military officers expounded the theory. They were very keen on their work and had made accurate models in plywood on which to demonstrate the use of the various switches and the intricate working of the electrical apparatus. The atmosphere in the classroom was quite informal. Pupils as well as instructor could smoke if they wished, and any point not understood was queried on the spot. The men were patient and good-humored, but their theories were challenged sometimes. There was a little dispute one day when one of the girls suggested to the sergeant instructor that she had a better grasp of the subject than he had himself. "Well," said the sergeant, nettled, "you don't suppose I got my stripes for good looks, do you?" "Decidedly not," was the caustic reply, and the class rippled with amusement. The campsite covered a huge area, and was like a little town in itself, consisting of hundreds of large living quarter huts with 8 wings, and so-called spiders, smaller verandahed huts with gardens in front of them, which were the administrative offices, lecture huts, and lofty gymnasia, cook-houses, and dining halls of corrugated iron, AFIs, and rest-rooms and officers' messes, church huts, bedding stores, ration stores, meat stores, tailors and hairdressers, shops, post office, garrison theater, and garrison cinema, hockey, football, and basketball pitches, and 4 regimental parade grounds. Church parade generally involved a service in the garrison theater, but from time to time the regiments marched 2 miles to church in the neighboring town, swinging along behind our regimental band. My attention to the sermon on such occasions was tempered by the necessity to concentrate on rehearsing the commands I must give on the return journey. The parade would then be in reverse order, with the OFC regiment last, and as we wheeled on to the square for review by the colonel, the rest of the garrison would be already massed there. It was a petrifying moment when the officer in front of me disappeared as he wheeled to the right. I prayed for the band to play pianissimo so that my troop would hear my command. At the halt, facing left, form close column of troop. When the girls in a batch of trained crews were ready to be sent out to practice camp to complete their training, there would be a farewell party in the gym, and, as orderly officer that night, touring the quarters after 11 o'clock to see that lights were out and windows open, I would smile to see the groups coming back from the dance singing, "Yours till the end of the story," or just arm in arm together, the girls parting affectionately from the lads with whom they had worked and played, and promising to remember all they had been taught, while they urged each other to write often. It all seemed so splendid and innocent, until I overheard a comment in the gym one morning. "The men here are all wolves." Yes, and the officers are worse than the men. Then one evening, over in the mess, when I was sitting in the ante-room, after dinner holding a copy of Punch in my lap, while the conversation ebbed and flowed around me, I overheard a snippet of conversation between 2 young men. 95% of the women in this room are just dying for a spot of sex. I got up and moved away, little suspecting that I myself would soon be deeply and passionately involved. A month or so after our arrival at the camp, another batch of women officers came in, young, pretty and intelligent girls, fresh from the officer cadet training unit, which had replaced Cadet Wing as a training school for ATS officers. There were now 100 or so military officers in garrison mess, and about 30 women officers. It was the custom on Sunday evenings for the sergeant's mess to entertain the officers, male and female, and when, on the next evening, one of the girls, who shared my quarters in the Spider, said, "Are you coming, Petal?" I decided to go along. There were such frequent changes of personnel in the camp that I had found it quite impossible to keep track of all the male officers belonging to the mess. I knew my own regiment's battery commanders and captains, but the officers of the other regiment which used the mess seemed to be here one week and gone the next. They brought men in 4 short refresher courses on the new instruments and took them to firing camp at the end of the course, then returned with another set. On this Sunday evening, among such a bevy of youth and beauty, I did not expect to be asked to dance. I knew, because I had often been told so, that my legs were like church pillars, my face like the rising sun, and my hands like raw beef, and that my hair, which had once been perhaps my chief adornment, in later years had lost its luster and was indeed now heavily streaked with gray. In the sergeant's mess, therefore, I sat on one of the chairs which circled the room, quietly enjoying the evening, the fug of tobacco smoke, the glowing reflection of the stove fire in the polished linoleum, the hearty laughter from the bar, and the rhythm of the dancing feet. From time to time, however, I was asked to dance and urged to have a drink. I enjoyed the dancing and toyed with the cocktail. I was sitting out with my last partner, a Scottish captain with a delightful accent, and in his eye a glint of humor. When the last waltz was announced, he stood up with a gesture of invitation and took me in his arms. As we danced, I began to feel disturbed. There was a magnetism about this man. I must find out who he was. "I don't think I know you," I said. "Well, ye should do," said my partner. "Ye've danced with me 4 times already this night." "Good heavens," I said, shocked. "But are you sure?" "Certes," he said. We danced on in silence. Then he spoke again. "Well, are ye going to tell me your name?" I was jolted back to the moment. Of course," I said. "My name is Mary Taylor, and I'm PT officer in the OFC regiment. What's yours?" "Ye can call me Jim," he said. "Och, the dance is ending. Let's get away before the crowd. I'll be seeing ye home." As we walked towards the officers' quarters, I found the night intoxicating. A soft wind brushed the heavens before the fading moonlight, and down near the horizon the sky was pricked by a few faint stars. Jim took me by the arm. Holding me possessively by the elbow, we passed the black bulk of the officers' mess, but instead of turning into the road to the quarters, Jim went ahead, propelling me on towards the end of the camp. "Where does this road lead to?" he asked, adding, "I'm a new boy." "It goes down to the swimming pool," I replied. "It's not a real swimming pool. It's a lovely pool under the trees." "Come on," said Jim. "We'll go and look at it." Again I felt a sudden rise of emotion. There was something about this man, something debonair and masterful, that had a powerful effect on me. For a brief moment of shock, I imagined his lips on mine, and I trembled. We turned in at the little gate, and rustled through the fallen leaves, latticed with bars of moonlight and shadow, to the wooden bench under an elm tree. We sat down, and Jim took my hand. "Are ye married?" he asked. "No," I replied. "Pure taste the lads have down here," he said. It took me a moment to recognize the compliment. "Any boy friends?" "No," I said again. "Why not, for heaven's sake?" I paused. Then I said, "They seem to be afraid of me." "Afraid of ye? Why on earth?" "They think I disapprove of them." "And do ye?" "No, indeed." There was another pause. Then I added, "I used to be a school teacher." "Ah," said Jim expressively, as if he thought that explained everything. The ripples on the pool were so brilliant that they were almost blinding. I shut my eyes. Something was about to happen, something cataclysmic. Then Jim's arm was around my shoulder, and his hand tilting my face to his. "No," I cried, struggling, overcome with panic. But as his lips met mine, the resistance flowed out of me, and a warmth of passion and yearning began to fill my whole body. During the next few weeks I suffered deeply. My body was tortured by denial, and my mind was torn by indecision. Jim used all his blandishments to try to persuade me to go away with him for the weekend. He told me it would do me good, that the important side of my nature had been starved, that it was the experience I needed to turn me into a woman. He told me, too, that if I yielded to him, the cravings of my body would be satisfied. One day I said to him, "You know, you don't look like an unmarried man." Jim laughed. "Are ye asking me if I'm married?" he said, and I nodded. "Well, I am," he replied, "and I've got a lovely little daughter." He assured me that if we went away together, no one would know. It was not, however, the fear of discovery which held me back. It was the conviction that one cannot buy happiness at the price of someone else's happiness. And, anyhow, someone would know. I should know, and that was enough for me. Surely, I thought, real love cannot be associated with guilt. When I was in love, I should want to be able to shout it from the housetops, and I should expect my man to feel the same way. And there was something else, which I tried to express one day. Something about a baby. Jim said quickly, "Oh, no fear of that." He did not understand. I had always wanted a baby, a red-haired sprite, to call back the lovely April of my prime. If only I knew what was right and what was wrong. In my dilemma, I sought the opinions of some of the younger women in the mess. "What do you think of people who have affairs?" I asked. "Well, look around you," was the reply. "You'll find that the people who have affairs generally also have the more contented faces." This remark was not much help, because I did not know which were the people who had affairs. I tried again. "Does the modern man no longer set any store by chastity in a woman?" "Most of them know," I was told, "except for reasons of health." One Thursday evening I sat alone in my barrack room and wrestled with the problem. I wanted to do what was right, but I felt that my judgment was clouded. It seemed as though there was some irresistible force at work, combining with the inclinations of my body. to compel my will. At last I found myself acquiescing. I wrote a note to Jim, indicating that I was prepared to go away with him that weekend, and I went over to the mess and put it in his pigeonhole. When I was falling asleep that night, I thought, after the weekend I shall never belong entirely to myself again. On Friday morning I did not see Jim at breakfast time. This was nothing unusual. The long tables filled and empty as the meal progressed, since the officers came in at different times. At lunch time I saw him at the meal, but did not catch his eye, and he went straight out again after he had eaten. I began to feel humiliated. The decision which had cost me so much appeared to be of no consequence to him. I thought Jim might look in at my office during the afternoon, but though I stayed late, he did not put in an appearance. At 5 o'clock I went over to the mess. I was slowly climbing the steps when the door at the top swung open, and he hurried out. He looked very smart in his Royal Artillery uniform, with polished brass and leather. As he skipped down the steps, he flashed me a smile, and cast over his shoulder a brief, "I'll be seeing you tonight." I felt completely deflated. I did not know what the cryptic message implied. I could not guess whether he had made any plans for the weekend, nor even if he had accepted my offer. Tears of loneliness slid from under my lids. Was this what it meant to be in love? That night I was orderly officer, and had no time to brood or worry. Whenever my duties permitted it, I found my way to the anteroom, in the vain hope that Jim would be there. I returned finally at 11 o'clock. The room was empty, except for one officer sitting at a table writing letters. I fingered 1 or 2 magazines, glancing at the clock again, and then turned to go back to my quarters. Before I had reached the outside door, Jim was there. He took me by the elbow, piloting me between the disarranged chairs, till we came to the settee at the bottom of the long room. He was full of laughter, apologized that he had not answered my note, explained that he was on duty and must stay in camp for the weekend, and invited me to have dinner with him at the hotel in the town on Sunday evening. "Why, thank you," I said. "How nice. It's my birthday on Sunday." It was obvious that Jim was not so deeply involved emotionally as I was in this relationship, but that perhaps was a good thing. At any rate, I had something to look forward to.